This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and today is Wednesday, and that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today we're going to look at the worst 3-mana cards. While 3 mana isn't an insane amount, you should expect your 3-mana card to do something that helps you win the game and doesn't actively hurt your chances of winning. But that just isn't true of all 3-mana cards, as we'll see in this video. While the cards that appear on this list and the order that they appear in is ultimately left to my opinion, I do use data to help inform my opinion. To make it on this list, a card has to be bad in all 60 card constructed formats, has to be bad in Commander, and it has to be bad in Limited. In other words, the card can't just be bad in one format. It has to be bad in all of them. The card also has to always have been bad. I'm not just looking at today's 60 card constructed formats, I'm also looking at the past. In all, there are 5,799 3-mana cards in Magic, and in this video, I'll give you my picks for the worst of them. At number 10, it is Saprazan Raider. As usual, it is kind of hard for creatures to make really broad worst lists like this one, and that's because by their very nature they actually add to the board and they can attack and block. The other cards on the list basically don't do anything, but Saprazan Raider is an awful enough creature to make the list anyway. This 3-mana 1/2 returns to your hand when it gets blocked. In other words, it's a creature with an awful stat line that also has an ability that is almost entirely downside. It isn't quite all downside because it basically can't die in combat when it attacks, but there's basically no reason your opponent won't just block it with one of their creatures every time it attacks, in which case you're wasting your time. It doesn't even get to do damage, it simply returns to your hand before that happens. You might be able to combo it with some stuff that gives your creatures into the battlefield abilities, but there are countless better ways to do that. Basically, with the Raider, you're left with a creature that can either ineffectively chump block or ineffectively attack, and that's pretty close to not doing anything. At number 9, I have Tripwire. This 3-mana sorcery can only kill a creature with horsemanship. That's an ability that only appears on a handful of cards, and most of them don't see any play at all. As a result, most of the time, Tripwire simply won't do anything. The only reason I have it this low on the list is because if there's some weird future where horsemanship does become a widely used keyword ability, Tripwire would become a significantly better card. For now, though, it's one of the worst 3-mana cards in the game. At number 8, it is Flowstone Armor. Equipment as we know it today didn't make its debut until 2003's Mirrodin. However, pretty much from the beginning, they were trying to design cards that had similar flavor, an artifact your creature could wield to change its stats. These designs usually looked like Flowstone Armor. It's a 3-mana artifact. You can pay 3 and tap it to give a creature +1/-1 as long as Flowstone Armor remains tapped, and you can choose not to untap it. So you can see the equipment feel they were going for. Unfortunately, they wildly overcosted basically every card that used this type of design, and Flowstone Armor is a great example of that. You have to pay 6 mana before it does anything, and what it does isn't particularly impactful. One thing that it can do that equipment these days can't do is that it can target opposing creatures, so it can operate as a super overcosted way to kill opposing X1s, but that small bit of upside doesn't make up for the fact that this is basically never going to deliver anything that is even remotely worth the mana or the card. At number 7, it is Celestial Prism. This 3-mana artifact lets you pay 2 mana and tap it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Basically, this is a useless chunk of metal when it hits the battlefield. Filtering mana is already a bad effect, especially on a 3-mana artifact. If we imagine that this only cost 1 to filter instead of 2, it would still be a bad card, and the fact it requires you to pay 2 is downright outrageous. This is especially true because 3-mana mana rocks that can tap for mana of any color, just straight up, are dime a dozen these days, but even in its own time this was terrible. It's basically never worth paying this much mana and doing this much work just to get 1 mana of any color. The Prism also has some of the worst art in the game, so it basically has nothing going for it. At number 6, I have the entire Shrine cycle from Odyssey. These enchantments all cost 1 generic and 2 colored mana, and they all trigger when a player plays a spell and have some sort of effect based on the number of cards in each graveyard with the same name as that spell. They all kind of do color-appropriate things. The white one gains you life, the black one makes a player discard cards, the blue one can counter spells, the red one does damage, and the green one makes creature tokens. Obviously, cards that do things with cards of the same name are near useless in EDH because it's a singleton format, but these were also horrible in 60-card constructed formats at the time too, mostly because they're entirely symmetrical and you can end up helping your opponent as much as you help yourself. As a result, none of these have ever seen play anywhere. At number 5, it is Mudhole. This 3-mana instant exiles all land cards from a player's graveyard, and yeah, that's it. That is the whole card. Paying 3 mana for that effect is pretty insane, especially because Magic has always had much cheaper cards that can just exile an entire graveyard. So spending this much mana to get rid of only cards of a certain type is very silly. Pretty much since the debut of Life from the Loam, there have been decks that try to do insane stuff with lands in the graveyard in multiple formats. But even with that being the case, Mudhole hasn't ever seen any play. Basically, even though there is a deck that exists that's all about lands in the graveyard, nobody plays Mudhole. After all, it can't actually exile Life from the Loam itself. There are just better ways to hit on the graveyard, and there is virtually no reason you should be playing this very specific type of graveyard hate. At number 4, I have Common Cause. This 3-mana enchantment gives all non-artifact creatures +2/+2 as long as they share a color. When you first read this, it probably doesn't seem that bad, especially because the card designs we're used to today are rarely symmetrical. But this is. It looks at all creatures on the table, including your opponent's. That's something you have virtually no control over. You have to count on you and your opponent both only playing monocolored decks of the same color for this to offer its bonus, and even when it does, it offers that bonus to your opponent's creatures too. Basically, this is either doing nothing or offering your opponent's creatures the same boost as your creatures, which will also pretty much feel like it isn't doing anything. It is the most widely played card of any on this list, but I have a feeling at least half of the people who've put it in a deck on EDH Rec haven't realized what this card's actual effect is, otherwise they wouldn't be using it. At number 3, it is Hint of Insanity. This 3-mana sorcery makes your opponent reveal their hand and discard all non-land cards with the same name as another card in their hand. Obviously, that's near useless in a singleton format, so much of the time, this does nothing but give you information, and that is never worth it. It isn't good in 60-card constructed formats either, and it never has been. It's too likely to whiff, even in a situation where people are playing lots of 4-ofs. You really need a 3-mana discard spell to guarantee at least one card is going to get discarded, and this just doesn't do it. And in fact, it will do absolutely nothing the majority of the time, and obviously, that's not something you want to play. I've said this before, but I think it bears repeating. If you disagree with my evaluation of this card, well, I think you've probably got more than just a hint of insanity. At number 2, I have bad color hosers that cost 3 mana, Evaporate, Inquisition, and Heroism. I've talked about Evaporate and Inquisition in the very recent past in the Worst Sorceries video, so I'll just say that they both really inefficiently hate on a particular color or colors, and even in their ideal scenarios, they don't do a very good job. Let's talk about Heroism though. This 3-mana enchantment lets you sacrifice a white creature to prevent combat damage from all attacking red creatures, provided their controller doesn't pay 2 generic and a red. So this is a white card that is meant to hate on red, but there's so much wrong with it. First off, a fog effect already isn't exactly amazing, though a repeatable one does get a little better. Problem is, your opponent can very easily play around this by paying the mana. After all, they can enter combat with all of their mana up. And because they're a red deck, they're pretty likely to be able to pay the cost. So in short, this is another card that basically doesn't do anything. I know some people will see this card and say, but wait, it's a free sacrifice outlet in white, that's pretty unique. And I guess you would be right, although that won't really make the card that good. But there's also a problem with the idea that this is a unique white sacrifice outlet, and the problem is that this card is technically one with a red-white identity. This is a case where the spirit of the rule and the letter of the rule are at odds, because it isn't like the person playing this card ever pays 2 generic and a red, but the rules about color identity as they currently stand say this is a red-white card. And once you have red in the mix, a free sacrifice effect feels a lot less unique. And at number 1, I have the Landwalk Hate Cycle from Legends. Each of these 3-mana enchantments makes it so that creatures with a Landwalk ability in that color can be blocked. This type of tech has never really been worth it. Sure, there have been some good Landwalk creatures over the years, but never enough that having any of these in your sideboard was worth it. I mean, even in the whole history of the game since these were printed, there really haven't been that many cards with Landwalk. Wizards never used it a lot, and it was retired completely several years ago. Even if there was just a single 3-mana enchantment that turned off all Landwalk, it would still not be a good card, and this cycle is definitely not good. Against most decks, these do stone nothing. So those are my picks for the worst 3-mana cards in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards, check out the description, where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on past videos, including many more that look at the worst cards in the game, you should see some playlists on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.